Hello, my name is Jeffrey Malone,
And I'm Darr.
and this is our response for quiz number 6 for Africana Studies 375 with Dr. Brian Carter. And we'll be talking about the Harlem Renaissance as a whole. So in general terms, the Harlem Renaissance was a time of cultural, social, and artistic expression that was centered in Harlem, New York. It refers to the historical period that featured an African-American movement that took place primarily between the end of World War I to the mid to late 1930s. The true beginning of the Harlem Renaissance is often debated, and there are numerous dates cited as the true start to this Renaissance. One of these dates is 1917. The Great Negro Migration of the early 20th century saw masses of African Americans migrating north to escape the black codes and lynchings of the South. They came to the North looking for better wages, jobs, and conditions. At this same time, the white male population was forming unions. When the union workers went on strike, African Americans were quick to fill their positions, looking to advance and grow their community. This, however, outraged the white union workers, resulting in the largest race and labor-related riot of the 20th century. Over 200 people were killed and burned out of their homes in the 1917 race riots of East St. Louis. The black community responded to this violence by organizing the silent protest parade that marched through Harlem and included over 10,000 individuals protesting the racial violence and the minimal opportunities for African Americans. Another date that is looked upon as a beginning point to the Harlem Renaissance is the year 1919. In this year, the Harlem Hellfighters returned to Harlem after fighting in World War I. They illuminated the Harlem scene as they marched through Harlem. Also in 1919 was the Red Summer. This was a series of race riots in metropolitan cities in the North and South during the summer of 1919. The summer was very violent and bloody and saw a drastic rise in the number of lynchings. Between the race riots and the Red Summer, this moved the African American community into action as the need for racial equality became all the more clear. Suppressed by the white community, African Americans turned to art and writing to express themselves and to convey to others their life as a Negro. This idea would eventually lead to the Civic Club banquet. This interracial banquet would serve as a place where white publishers and black writers and artists could collaborate and work to advance racial equality through art and literature. This event, the Civic Club banquet, is considered by many scholars to be the official start of the new Negro movement. This movement allowed Negro writers and artists to rise to prominence in and beyond the black community. Dylan, do you have any examples of some writers or essays perhaps that reflect this?
I do. So one of the most important pieces in black literature written during this time was Alain Locke's The New Negro. The book was a collection of writings and essays written by African Americans and was a landmark in black literature. The Harlem Renaissance is often referred to as the New Negro movement after Locke's anthology. The term New Negro described a new, independent, and self-conscious African American group that became known for being outspoken about their racial group's poor treatment and defiant against the Jim Crow segregation laws and racist practices of the South. Its members showed great racial pride and attempted to uplift their race and challenge white racist and stereotypical opinions of their minority group through creative works of literature, art, and music. Locke and the New Negro focused on the concept of race building and the potential for black equality. The anthology inspired blacks to no longer allow themselves to be pushed around and forced to adjust to white ideals and their unreasonable requests. Instead, they would strive for equal treatment. Locke's work helped pave the way for black artists and authors like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Nella Larson, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, Jessie Fawcett, and Jean Toomer, and inspired a whole nation of African Americans into action. The influential works from these individuals primarily voiced the everyday struggles of African Americans dealing with racism, promoted African American self-consciousness and pride, which were concepts of black identity, and protested violence and discrimination against the minority group, and illustrated everyday living in the black community of Harlem. The authors, through their works, not only helped to create a feeling of unity and understanding between African Americans living in Harlem, but also inspired its readers to have pride in themselves and their ethnicity, and stand up for their rightful human liberties.
Great. Do you have any specific essays or referring to maybe Locke's New Negro essay in particular?
Yeah, I have one right here. In the essay The New Negro, Alain Locke describes a social realization or awakening that has happened in the 1920s Harlem society as they realized the recent emergence of a new breed of African Americans, the new Negro, as opposed to the traditional old Negro of the past. To describe this social awakening, Locke writes, "For the younger generation is vibrant with a new psychology. The new spirit is awake in its masses, and under the very eyes of the professional observers is transforming what has been a perennial problem into the progressive phases of contemporary Negro life." However, according to Locke, this transformation, this metamorphosis, if you will, did not happen overnight. The old Negro has long been more of a myth than a man, and for generations the Negro has been more of a formula than a human being, something to be argued about, condemned, or defended, to be kept down, or in his place, or helped up, to be worried with, or worried over, harassed, or patronized, a social bogey, or a social burden. It has something white society has had to deal with, because it isn't capable for independently acting or making a use for itself. It has had to rely on others to do something or act a certain way for, in order to have meaning or a purpose. The problems that arise from white society viewing this group in this way is compounded by the fact that for years, even the thinking Negro has been induced to share this attitude in his distortive perspective. As Locke writes, his shadow, so to speak, has been more real to him than his personality. However, as the great Negro migration has occurred, great masses of Negroes, the African, the West Indian, and now the Negro American, have gathered together in these migratory meccas, such as Harlem. Negro life is seizing upon its first chances for group expression and self-determination. This social capital of a sort has given rise to African American folk, art, music, poetry, and literature, aspects of a creative mindset, essential and symbolic to this new Negro identity. These creative works of the new generation have both led to the new Negro gradually earning more respect as well as cementing his position in the Harlem community. For too long, in the minds of blacks and whites alike have been burrowed in the trenches of the Civil War and Reconstruction, that we haven't realized that a new societal development has flanked us, necessitating a sudden reorientation of view. For according to Locke, we have not been watching in the right direction. We have not noticed the east till the sun has us blinking. Now, can you tell me of any other authors or significant essays they wrote during this time?
Yeah, I have Langston Hughes, one of my favorite authors during this time, and I'll talk about him and also his essay, The Negro Artist on the Race Mountain. So Langston Hughes was one of the most influential figures of the Harlem Renaissance. Hughes' poetry depicted the lives and experiences of ordinary black people, and thusly appealed to the same group of people. He wrote about what he knew, the people, the places, the events, and the history that surrounded him. Hughes, like so many of his Renaissance counterparts, felt that it was imperative to be able to understand and appreciate one's African roots. For this reason, his stories and poetry greatly influence and appeal to the lower class, or the, quote, low-down folks. The life and works of Langston Hughes did not solely speak to African-American population, however. He has inspired and continues to inspire generations of human beings, as is evident in his essay, The Negro Artist and the Race Mountain. And this is an excerpt from this particular essay. One of the most promising of the young Negro poets said to me once, "I want to be a poet, not a Negro poet," meaning, I believe, I want to write like a white poet, meaning subconsciously, I would like to be a white poet, meaning behind that, I would like to be white. And I was sorry the young man said that, for no great poet has ever been afraid of being himself. And I doubted then that, with this desire to run away spiritually from his race, this boy would never be a great poet. But this is the mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art in America. This urge within the race towards whiteness, the desire to pour racial individuality into the mold of American standardization and to be as little Negro and as much American as possible. In this essay, Langston Hughes, he develops the illustrating of the black consciousness in America. And it's extremely profound not only for the new Negro in the 1920s, but for the 21st black century individual as well. By simply illustrating Hughes' ideals and thoughts that sometimes played around the topics of race, specifically the black race, provided a counter-narrative for the mainstream story being force-fed to the American society. This concept is reflected as a mountain in the Hughes essay, The Negro Artist and the Race Mountain. A mountain is oftentimes thought of as a strenuous conflict or block on a path to cross. However, throughout the essay, Hugh's descriptions of the mountain leads to the conclusion that the mountain will remain in place. There is no moving this mountain. There is no pushing it aside, no hiding from it, no making it invisible, or no cutting it down. The mountain of race will forever remain in its place. The burden, however, is confronting the mountain, also known as the race issue, by discovering ways in which the mountain can be crossed, so that individuals to come later can have the knowledge, and those who successfully come out on the other side.
Great.
Do you have anything, maybe another example, an essay or a person?
Yeah, I do. Now, despite the great admiration and respect for W.E.B. Du Bois as an individual and as a social activist, Du Bois's ideas for the advancement and recognition of African Americans were not without contrasting voices expressing doubt and skepticism in his ideas. One such opinionated individual was named Eric Walrond. Walrond claimed that all contemporary black leaders were essentially inadequate or ineffective in dealing with the cultural and political aspirations of black masses. Walrond was an Afro-Caribbean writer and journalist. That's literary works would make a lasting contribution to literature for years to come, as well as an immediate impact in New York during the 1920s. Walrond spent a great portion of his life traveling, as he was born in Guyana, moved to Barbados, then Panama, New York, and finally to England, where he settled down. While living in New York, he worked as the editor and co-owner for the African-American weekly publication Brooklyn and Long Island Informer. He was soon after hired as the associate editor of Negro World, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA, their official publication. Despite working with Marcus Garvey's organization and receiving an award from Garvey himself at one point, Walrond would speak out against Garvey's ideas, which would be known as Garveyism. In 1923, Walrond wrote one of his signature essays, The New Negro Faces America, in which he claimed that the new breed of African American, the new Negro, was race conscious. However, he does not want to be like the white man. He is coming to realize the great possibilities within himself. The new Negro, who does not want to go back to Africa, is fondly cherishing an ideal, and that is that the time will come when America will look upon the Negro not as a savage with an inferior mentality, but as a civilized man. In his essay, Walrond would go on to declare that the rank and file of Negroes are opposed to Garveyism, dissatisfied with the personal vituperation and morbid satire of Mr. Du Bois, and prone to discount Major Moton's Tuskegee as a monument of respectable reaction. While most likely not in the majority, Walrond voiced the opinions of some African Americans at the time in that Du Bois's principles and Marcus Garvey's Pan-African movement ideas were not the most effective way to gain African American equality and recognition. Now, can you think of any novels written during the time that could express African American ideals?
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple ones that I can think of. I think Nella Larsen's Passing is a very good one to talk about. And Nella Larsen was an African American author, and she wrote a novel called Passing. And Passing described a practice called racial passing, in which a member of one racial group, in most cases here, African Americans, they could pass as another, and they attempted to assimilate into the other racial group. The novel was largely inspired by Larsen's own life, in which she was seemingly trapped between white and black culture, and the novel reflects her personal struggles that plagued her due to this discomfort. She wasn't necessarily passing, but she was very much trapped in between these two races. And furthermore, the novel describes the plight that many desperate African Americans, or those of mixed race, went through to improve their living conditions and treatment. During this time, individuals who had parents of multiple races had a hard time fitting in society. And these African Americans of mixed race could often pass as white, and would often do so in an attempt to gain the benefits that the white public had. People of both European and African heritage frequently struggled to find their identity. They didn't really fit in anywhere. Living in the white community isolated themselves from their families back home, and then also led to severe depression. And at the same time, these individuals didn't entirely belong in the black community. If an individual was caught passing, the punishments were extremely severe, but for many, the reward outweighed this risk. Dylan, do you have any other essays that we've recently studied?
Yeah. In fact, Wallace Thurman wrote a novel called The Blacker the Berry, and that really discusses ideas very much in line with Larson's life experience and her novel passing, as well as her experiences through that. So this novel was considered groundbreaking for its exploration of colorism and racial discrimination within the black community, where lighter skin was often favored, especially for women. It tells a story of a girl named Emma Lou Morgan, a young black woman with dark skin. It begins in Boise, Idaho, and follows Emma Lou in her journey to college at USC and eventually through a move to Harlem, New York City for work. Set during the Harlem Renaissance, the novel explores Emma Lou's experiences with colorism and discrimination by lighter-skinned African Americans due to her dark skin. She learns that she must come to terms with her skin color in order to find satisfaction in her life. Emma Lou struggles with her racial identity for her entire life, and she constantly tries to find a place to fit in. By the end of The Blacker the Berry, Emma Lou has come to realize that she has wasted her time and much of her life by not living her life to its fullest potential and despising her own racial identity. She spent her whole life running and pushing people away. And after living in Harlem and meeting successful and prideful African Americans, Emma decided to accept herself for who she is, and she accepts her racial identity. This novel reflects what was occurring both in Harlem and around the nation during the 1920s, and is truly a major landmark work of the new Negro movement. Can you think of any type of entertainment form in Harlem during this time?
Yeah, for me, like when I think of the Harlem Renaissance, I immediately start thinking of music and what music was going on during the Harlem Renaissance. It would be jazz. And for me, jazz, more so than any other musical genre, has been intimately linked with legal and social equality for all, particularly for African Americans. And for this reason, jazz incomparably shaped the Harlem Renaissance in America. Every night, thousands of city dwellers would flock into Harlem to witness its incredible jazz scene. With its syncopated rhythms and improvised solos, jazz revolutionized the musical scene and meant that no two performances would ever be the same. It was born out of the black experience in America. Jazz originated in slave work songs, spirituals, blues, and then brass band music, and eventually ragtime. And by the end of the Harlem Renaissance, it had truly evolved into a thriving and viable genre of its own. And then when I think of jazz artists, there's so many that come to mind. There's Willie the Lion Smith, Fats Waller, Benny Goodman, Bessie Smith. There's just a ton. But I'm going to specifically talk about Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, who are two of the most truly influential artists, not just for the Harlem Renaissance, but also jazz as a genre. And their impacts are still felt both in through the Harlem Renaissance and their impact in music to this day. So Duke Ellington, he was actually born Edward Kennedy Ellington on April 29th, 1899 in Washington, D.C. At the age of 7, he began studying the piano, where he earned his nickname Duke for his gentlemanly ways. Ellington would turn down an art scholarship to the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn to follow his true passion for piano. In the 1920s, Ellington performed in Broadway nightclubs as the band leader of a sextet, a group which in time would grow to a 10-piece ensemble. Ellington sought out musicians with unique playing styles, such as Bubber Miley, who used a plunger to make the wah-wah sound, and Joe Nathan, who would give the world his famous trombone growl. At various times, his ensemble included the trumpeter Cootie Williams, cornetist Rex Stewart, and alto saxophonist Johnny Hodges. Ellington made hundreds of recordings with his bands, appeared in films and on radio, and toured Europe on 2 occasions in 1930. These were some of the first times that African Americans had been involved in this, being on the radio and in movies and touring. So he really opened the possibilities for African Americans, especially in music during this time. Ellington's fame, it continued to rise and it really hit the rafters in the 1940s when he composed some of his best and greatest and most memorable pieces, including Concerto for Cootie, Cottontail, and Coco. Some of his most popular songs include It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing, Sophisticated Lady, Prelude to a Kiss, Solitude, and Satin Doll. Edward Duke Ellington passed away on May 24th, 1974 in New York City. He was regarded as an important figure in compositions that acted as a cornerstone of the American heritage and culture. He was a genius of jazz compositions, an inspirational band leader, and a great contributor in jazz piano. Ellington's group, the Duke Ellington Orchestra, lives on today, playing in various concert halls and venues around the world, reminding us of his incredible impact on the world. Then I'll move on. Louis Armstrong, he was born on August 4th, 1901 in New Orleans, and he was born in a section so poor that it was nicknamed the battlefield. He would eventually leave Louisiana and move to New York, where he would cut dozens of records as a sidesman, creating inspirational jazz with other greats such as Sidney Bechet and backing numerous blues singers, namely Bessie Smith. Back in Chicago, O'Key Records decided to let Armstrong make his first records with a band under his own name, which he would entitle Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five. From 1925 until 1928, Armstrong made more than 60 records with the Hot Five and later the Hot Seven. Today, these are generally regarded as the most important and influential recordings in jazz history. On these recordings, Armstrong's virtuoso brilliance helped transform jazz from ensemble music to a soloist's art. He also began singing on these recordings, popularizing wordless scat singing with his hugely popular vocals on the 1926 recording of Heebie-Jeebies. Armstrong's popularity continued to grow, and he began playing in numerous different venues. Most importantly, I think, during his career, Armstrong set a number of African-American firsts. In 1936, he became the first African-American jazz musician to write an autobiography entitled Swing That Music. That same year, he became the first African-American to get featured billing in a major Hollywood movie with his turn in Pennies from Heaven starring Bing Crosby. Additionally, he became the first African-American entertainer to host a nationally sponsored radio show in 1937 when he took over Rudy Valley's Fleischman's Yeast show for 12 weeks. He was also a frequent presence on radio and often broke box office records at the height of what is now known as the swing era. Since his death on July 6, 1971, Armstrong's stature has only continued to grow. In the 80s and 90s, young African-American jazz musicians, including Wynton Marsalis, John Faddis, and Nicholas Payton, began speaking out about Armstrong's importance not only as a musician, but as a human being and his importance during the Harlem Renaissance. A series of new biographies on Armstrong really made his role as a civil rights pioneer abundantly clear, and subsequently argued for an embrace of his entire career output, not just the revolutionary recordings of the 1920s. Armstrong is arguably the most important figure in 20th century music. His innovations are widely recognized today and will continue to come for decades. And it's important to note it's not just his music, it's what he did for civil rights as an activist that also continues to live on today. But anyway, do you have anything else besides jazz that was kind of an important entertainment form?
In fact, during the Harlem Renaissance, dance was becoming a very big part of their culture. So dancers such as Florence Mills, George Snowden, Earl Tucker, Herbert White, and the Nicholas brothers wowed white and black audiences alike, depending on where they were allowed into the clubs. But they wowed them in nightclubs and cabarets such as the extremely popular Cotton Club. But one such dancer that I want to talk about in particular was named Bill Robinson, who embodied this form of entertainment during the Renaissance. So Bill Bojangles Robinson was born in Richmond, Virginia, and at just age 6, he was already dancing in local saloons. So after signing with agent Marty Forkins, allowing him the chance to dance as a solo act rather than in pairs, and after moving to Harlem, New York, Robinson landed a role in the all-black musical performance Blackbirds of 1928. Following the performance in front of a primarily white audience, his popularity soared. Robinson specialized in a form of tap dancing that featured him dancing high on his toes, moving his upper body gracefully and displaying a lightness and finesse that audiences had never seen before. Rather than follow his predecessors in a frantic style of tap dance, Robinson shunned that style, and he elected to perform in an elegant and precise fashion. Despite his massive popularity, Robinson was never able to be part of commercially successful films that were modeled on racist stereotypes. Nonetheless, Robinson did successfully perform regularly at Harlem's Cotton Club and was named part of the Broadway cast for an African American musical called Hot Mikado. He was even named honorary mayor of New York and mascot of New York Giants baseball team at the time, while overcoming many racial barriers present during his performing career in Harlem. Robinson revolutionized dancing as a form of entertainment and would go on to become a legend of the Harlem Renaissance era. Now, so we've covered jazz music and a little bit of dancing. Were African Americans using any other forms to express themselves?
Yeah, they weren't just using to express themselves and their culture through music, specifically jazz and dance, and they also weren't just using literature. They were really vastly using art. And three of the most influential artists of the New Negro movement included Aaron Douglas, William Henry Johnson, and Augustus Savage. Aaron Douglas, he was an African-American painter and a graphic artist, and he played a leading role in the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. For his work and dedication to the African-American cause, he earned his nickname Father of Black American Art. Douglas arrived in Harlem in 1925 and quickly became immersed in Harlem's cultural life, contributing to the opportunity and the crisis. Douglas created powerful images of African-American life and struggles and won awards for the work he created for these publications. This would ultimately lead him to receive a commission to illustrate Elaine's Locke, The New Negro, and Thurman's The Black of the Berry, both of which we've read in class. Douglas's unique artistic style and ability to accurately portray the African-American society made him a popular commodity during the Renaissance. Some of his most famous illustration projects include his images for Jane Weldon Johnson's poetic work, God's Trombone, and Paul Moran's Black Magic. In 1933, Douglas began work on one of his most legendary works, a series of murals entitled Aspects of Negro Life. It featured 4 panels, and each depicted a different part of the African-American experience. Each of these murals then included a captivating mix of Douglas's influences ranging from jazz music to abstract and geometric art. At a special memorial service for Douglas held at Fisk University, a university where he once taught for 30 years, the university president remembered Douglas by stating, "Aaron Douglas was one of the most accomplished of the interpreters of our institution and cultural values. He captured the strength and quickness of the young. He translated the memories of the old, and he projected the determination of the inspired and courageous." Would you like to talk about William Henry Johnson and Augustus Savage?
Yes, I would. So William Henry Johnson was an artist who made us of a primitive style of painting to depict the experience of African Americans during the Harlem Renaissance and beyond. Johnson, during his early life, would explore Europe, and during this time he would meet German textile artist Holzke Krock. As a biracial couple, Johnson and Krock faced extensive racism and discrimination in the United States. They found solace, however, in acceptance by the enlightened individuals of Harlem. Johnson's work is unique in that it is considered to be primitivism. His work during the time displayed brighter colors and two-dimensional objects, often portraying African American life in Harlem, the South, and the military. Some of his works, including paintings depicting black soldiers fighting on the front line, as well as the segregation that took place there, would eventually serve as commentaries on the treatment of African Americans in the U.S. Army during World War II. Yet another artist during the time was Augustus Savage. He's best remembered as an artist, activist, and arts educator, serving as an inspiration to the many that she taught, helped, and encouraged. She moved to New York in the 1920s after a failed attempt to establish herself as a sculptor in Jacksonville, Florida. Eventually, she would start to make a name for herself as a portrait sculptor in Harlem. Her works from this time included portraits of leading African Americans of the time, including W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Savage was considered to be one of the leading artists of the Harlem Renaissance. During the Great Depression, Savage helped many young African American artists and lobbied the WPA on behalf of African American artists to found the Harlem Artists Guild. She would eventually serve at the WPA's Harlem Community Center, which offered art instructions for all kinds of students. Augustus Savage was commissioned to create a sculpture for the 1939 New York World's Fair. It was entitled The Harp and was one of her greatest works. Savage lives on today for her influence in Harlem as an artist, educator, and activist. Now, the last work of the Renaissance that I want to talk about was Zora Neale Hurston's Jonah's Gourdvine. It was her first essay and was about her immediate family and the life of an autonomous African-American polity called Eatonville, Florida. The novel was largely ignored by the black population with the exception of Charles and James Weldon Johnson and Alain Locke. The book is described as being less a narrative than a series of linguistic moments representing the folk life of the Black South. So now that we've covered all this, we've kind of gone through the life of Harlem. Now, can you tell me about how it went out, so to say?
Yeah, the Harlem Renaissance came to an end during the Great Depression, mostly because the African American community counted on the wealthy white patrons who were drastically hurt by the recession to contribute to the success of their shows. As David Levering Lewis states in his novel When Harlem Was in Vogue, the Depression accelerated a failure that was inevitable. Harlem was not immune to the strife of the Depression. In this city within a city, almost 50% of the families were out of work, with only a mere 9% of them receiving government relief jobs. This community's only hospital, the Harlem General Hospital, served 200,000 persons. Diseases like syphilis, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and typhoid ran rampant throughout Harlem, with 2 black mothers and 2 black babies dying for every white mother and white child. On the evening of March 19, 1935, a riot broke out and swept down Lenox Avenue. It started with a rumor that Lino Rivera, a young Puerto Rican boy, had been beaten to death. In reality, he had only been slightly roughed up. 10,000 angry Harlemites responded to this and caused nearly $2 million of damage in white-owned commercial property. It was a direct reflection of the built-up tension from the recent issues in the recent increase in racial and social inequality. By the morning of March 20th, 1935, 3 Afro-Americans were dead, 30 people were hospitalized, and countless more were behind bars. The Dunbar News ran a column addressing the talented 10th, compelling them to, quote, lay their scissors and their pens aside. And such, the Harlem Renaissance came to an end. The Renaissance nevertheless inspired new authors, musicians, and black intellectuals during the civil rights movement. Furthermore, many believe that the movement has paved the way towards social equality in the arts within the American society. The ideals of the Harlem Renaissance live on far beyond the 1920s and 1930s. The Renaissance was a time unlike any other and saw the advancement of African Americans towards equality through art and literature. The effects of this new Negro movement can still be seen in present times and will certainly affect future generations of all backgrounds and races. But anyway, I think that's what we have for Quiz 6. Again, I'm Jeffrey Malone.
I'm Dylan Darr.
And this is our response for Quiz 6 for Africana Studies. Thank you.
Thanks.